Right now, dozens of videos online are telling you that Mel Gibson sat down, went quiet for a moment, and then confessed a secret about the end of the world, hidden inside a Bible most people have never heard of. Millions of people have watched these videos. Almost none of them have checked whether Mel Gibson actually said any of it. And the strange part is not that a celebrity quote got exaggerated somewhere along the way. The strange part is that when you go looking for the original moment, the actual interview, the actual camera, the actual room where this supposedly happened, it is not there. By the end of this, you are going to know exactly what these videos are actually built from, why they all sound so eerily similar to each other, and what the real, genuinely fascinating book underneath all of this fabrication actually says: no invented celebrity required. Picture the object at the center of all this confusion the way it actually exists, because it deserves to be understood on its own terms before we get anywhere near the fabricated version. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church maintains what is, by a wide margin, the largest actively used biblical canon of any Christian tradition on earth today. Not 66 books, the number most Protestant readers grew up with. 81 officially, 46 in the Old Testament, 35 in the New, translated originally from the Greek Septuagint and preserved for centuries in Ge'ez, an ancient liturgical language still used in Ethiopian Orthodox worship today, chanted in monasteries that have maintained continuous religious practice since long before most Western nations existed in anything like their current form. Among those 81 books sit texts that vanished almost entirely from Western Christianity, the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Maccabean books unique to this tradition alone. These are not obscure curiosities invented by isolation. They are texts that were genuinely widely read across early Judaism and early Christianity. Texts quoted directly inside the New Testament itself, that simply never made the cut when other church traditions eventually settled on their shorter canons centuries later. The Ethiopian church's own roots reach back to the 4th century, when King Ezana of the ancient kingdom of Aksum formally adopted Christianity, making Ethiopia one of the very first nations on earth to establish Christianity as a state religion, predating similar developments in much of Europe by centuries. Tradition within the church traces an even earlier connection, pointing to the Ethiopian eunuch described in the Book of Acts as evidence of Christian presence in the region even before Ezana's formal conversion. Whatever the precise earliest date, what is not in dispute is the sheer continuity involved. This is a living religious tradition that has preserved and actively used this exact expanded canon, largely undisturbed by the doctrinal disputes and canon-narrowing councils that reshaped Western Christianity for the better part of 2,000 years. Hold that fact in your hand for a second, because it is genuinely remarkable on its own, without any celebrity attached to it at all. The New Testament Book of Jude quotes the Book of Enoch by name, directly, treating it as a text worth citing to a first-century Christian audience. And yet, within a few centuries, most of Christianity had set Enoch aside entirely, while Ethiopia kept it, copied it, preserved it in complete form, century after century, through periods when the rest of the Christian world had lost access to full versions of it altogether. Scholars studying the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered starting in 1947 in the caves above Qumran, found Hebrew fragments of the Book of Jubilees among them, physical proof that this text was genuinely circulating and being copied by Jewish communities in the centuries before Christ, not invented later by Ethiopian Christians looking to pad their own canon. That confirmation did not come from Ethiopian sources defending their own tradition. It came from an entirely separate archaeological discovery half a world away, which is exactly the kind of independent corroboration that gives a historical claim real weight. So here is a book, a real book, sitting inside a real, ancient, still practicing religious tradition, containing material genuinely lost to most of the Christian world and genuinely verified by outside archaeology. That should already be more than enough to build a fascinating documentary around. And for centuries it largely was, studied by real scholars of early Judaism and Christianity, precisely because texts like Enoch offer a genuine window into what a broader swath of ancient believers actually thought about angels, judgment, and the end of the world, ideas that shaped early Christian theology in ways modern readers raised on the shorter Western canon rarely encounter directly. And yet, sometime in the last several months, a very different version of this story started spreading, one that does not center on the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, its scholars, or its manuscripts at all. It centers on a single, famous, very specific name, attached to claims nobody can actually trace back to him. That mismatch, a genuinely interesting real story getting quietly replaced by a much less verifiable one, is the first thread worth pulling. Here is the story as these videos currently tell it, and it is worth taking seriously enough to understand exactly why it spread so easily, because the framing is not stupid. It leans on something real, Mel Gibson has a well-documented, decades-long, publicly known personal investment in serious biblical history. His 2004 film about the final hours of Christ's life was famously researched for years, filmed with dialogue in Aramaic and Latin rather than English for the sake of historical texture, and became one of the most commercially successful and culturally discussed religious films of the 21st century. That project alone establishes, in the public's mind, a real and reasonable premise. Here is a public figure who has spent real money, real years, and real personal reputation, specifically on getting biblical history right. If that same person later encountered a genuinely underexplored ancient text and had something to say about it, that would not be an absurd thing to imagine happening. It would fit an established pattern. That is exactly why this particular fabrication works as well as it does, and it deserves to be said plainly. Nobody built this hoax around a celebrity chosen at random. They built it around one of the very few public figures whose existing, real, well-documented history makes a claim like this sound plausible before you have checked a single fact. A viewer scrolling past a video titled "With Gibson's name attached to a biblical revelation" is not being asked to believe something wildly out of character. They are being asked to believe a slightly exaggerated version of something that already fits everything they already know to be true about him. That is a genuinely effective piece of narrative engineering, whether or not the people building it thought of it in those terms. And understanding why it works is more useful than simply dismissing it as an obviously stupid lie nobody should have fallen for. It is also worth being fair to the audience these videos are actually reaching, rather than assuming anyone taken in by this was simply being careless. Interest in expanded biblical canons, apocryphal texts, and the specific question of what got left out of the modern Bible and why is a genuine, long-standing, entirely legitimate area of popular curiosity, one that predates any of these videos by decades. People who click on a video like this are very often the same people who would, in a different context, be genuinely interested in real academic work on the Dead Sea Scrolls or the historical formation of the biblical canon. The fabrication does not succeed by exploiting gullibility in some general sense. It succeeds by locating a real, underserved curiosity and offering a shortcut to satisfying it, one that borrows a trusted name instead of doing the slower work of citing actual scholarship. Here's where it starts to come apart. And it comes apart the moment you stop taking the framing at face value and start asking the single most basic question any of these videos should be able to answer. Where, specifically, did this happen? Go looking for the actual interview, the actual podcast appearance, the actual press conference where Gibson supposedly said any of this, and you run into silence almost immediately. Real, verified Gibson media appearances do exist and are easy to find, including a lengthy, widely covered appearance on one of the largest podcasts in the world, fully searchable, fully dated, fully attributable. None of them contain this claim. Not a paraphrase of it. Not a passing reference to it. Nothing. Now look closer, because the videos themselves, once you actually line several of them up, side by side, do not read like independent reporting on the same real event. They read like the same template, run through slightly different phrasing over and over again. Nearly identical titles keep surfacing across different channel names. Gibson Reveals, Gibson Breaks Silence, Gibson Explains, each one paired with some version of "and it's not what you think." Multiple separate uploads, credited to entirely different channel identities, all landed within roughly the same narrow window of time, all covering the exact same unverifiable claim, all using strikingly similar structural beats. The quiet pause, the confession-like delivery, the promise of something the church supposedly does not want you to know. Widen the lens a little further and the pattern gets even more specific. It is not only the Gibson claim that gets this exact templated treatment. The same content ecosystem is simultaneously producing near-identical videos about the Ethiopian Bible's supposed description of Jesus' physical appearance, about forbidden words Jesus allegedly spoke after the crucifixion, about 40 deleted days of his life, each one following the identical rhetorical formula. A familiar image challenged, a secretive institution blamed for hiding the truth, a dramatic reveal promised but never quite delivered in verifiable form. That is not what a single real, notable event generates. A real event generates one primary story that other outlets then reference and build on. This generates an entire assembly line of interchangeable variations on the same unverifiable premise, which is a structurally different phenomenon entirely. Here's where it gets stranger. At least one of these videos carries something you would not expect to find attached to genuine journalism about a real celebrity interview, a platform-level disclosure label applied directly by YouTube itself, stating that the sounds or visuals in that specific video were altered or fully generated. That is not a viewer's suspicion. That is not an outside fact-checker's conclusion. That is the hosting platform's own automated or reviewed system flagging, in writing, that at least part of what you're hearing is not simply footage of Mel Gibson talking. Some portion of what sounds like his voice, in at least this one confirmed instance, is synthetic. Now consider what that detail actually does to every other unlabeled video making the identical claim. If one confirmed instance in this exact cluster used artificially generated audio to simulate Gibson's voice, and if the surrounding videos share near identical scripts, structure, and unverifiable sourcing, the reasonable working assumption is not that this one video happened to be the exception. It is that this is very likely the production method behind the entire cluster, with some uploads simply not carrying a visible platform label yet, or using slightly more sophisticated synthesis that has not been flagged. A real quote requires exactly one authentic source. A fabricated quote can be regenerated, reworded, and re-uploaded indefinitely by any number of separate accounts, with no upper limit on how many versions can exist simultaneously, each one looking to an unsuspecting viewer like independent confirmation of the same story. So here's the question that has to hang over the rest of this. If there is no verified original interview, if the titles and structure across dozens of uploads are templated rather than independently reported, and if at least one confirmed instance in this exact cluster used AI-generated audio to simulate a real person's voice, what exactly are the millions of people who watch these videos actually listening to? And why did a genuinely fascinating, entirely real ancient text need a fabricated celebrity spokesperson attached to it in the first place? The investigation into what these videos are actually built from does not require any special access or classified information. It requires doing exactly what nobody watching casually on their phone during a scroll break has time to do. Checking the primary sourcing, one claim at a time, the same way any of the earlier investigations in this format have. Start with the most basic possible check, because it is the one almost nobody performs before sharing something like this. Search specifically and directly for any legitimate news outlet, entertainment publication, or religion desk that reported Gibson making a public statement about the Ethiopian Bible's end times content. Entertainment journalism, as an industry, is not shy about covering Gibson. His public statements, controversies, film projects, and media appearances get covered extensively, immediately, and often skeptically by outlets with no particular reason to protect or flatter him. A claim this specific and this dramatic, if it had actually happened at a real, datable event, would represent exactly the kind of coverage-worthy moment that outlet after outlet would have picked up within days. None of that coverage exists. Not a single dated, bylined, editorially reviewed piece connecting Gibson's name to this specific claim surfaces anywhere outside the video cluster itself and websites that appear to exist primarily to aggregate and rehost that same cluster's content. Now expand the search outward, because the absence of mainstream coverage is not, on its own, damning. Plenty of real things go uncovered by major outlets. What matters more is what does exist in that gap instead. What fills the space where a genuine news story would sit is a specific pattern. Independent blog posts and aggregator sites, several of them explicitly built around unrelated fringe historical claims, casually folding the Gibson claim into their own broader content without ever citing where they themselves got it. One such site, in the course of discussing the Ethiopian Bible more broadly, mentions Gibson's supposed interest almost as an aside, offering no interview date, no direct quote with attribution, no link to any primary source, treating the claim as if it were already common, settled knowledge simply because other similar content already existed, describing it the same way. That is exactly the pattern you would expect to see if a claim originated inside this exact content ecosystem, and then began circularly reinforcing itself. Each new piece treating the last piece's existence as its own evidence, rather than the pattern you would expect from a real event that happened once, in one place, and got independently verified afterward by multiple separate parties, checking the same underlying fact. Notice, too, what that same aggregator content sits alongside, because context matters here as much as the specific claim itself. The site casually mentioning Gibson's supposed interest in the Ethiopian Bible in the very same piece goes on to make an entirely separate and far more obviously unverifiable claim. That ancient, mile-scale trees once existed on Earth, and that formations like Devil's Tower in Wyoming are actually their fossilized stumps, misinterpreted by mainstream geology. That is not a neighboring coincidence. It is a genuinely useful piece of context, because it tells you exactly what kind of editorial standard, or lack of one, the Gibson claim is actually sitting inside. A publication willing to present a giant ancient tree stump theory with the same casual and critical confidence it uses for the Gibson quote is not a publication whose sourcing standards should be trusted on either claim. Look specifically, too, at how the videos handle their own visual evidence, because this is where the investigation stops being purely about absence and starts producing a positive, checkable finding. The platform disclosure label identified earlier did not appear on a random unrelated video. It appeared directly on one of the videos in this specific cluster, applied by the hosting platform's own content policies, which require this kind of label specifically when a video contains realistic AI-generated or synthetically altered audio or imagery likely to be mistaken for authentic footage of a real person. That is a meaningfully different situation from simply not being able to prove a negative. It is a positive, documented, platform-confirmed instance of synthetic media inside the exact content cluster making this claim, discovered through nothing more sophisticated than reading the disclosures the platform itself already provides directly beneath the video. Consider what it would have taken, practically, to produce dozens of these videos across this many separate channel identities within this tight window, because the production logistics themselves are part of the evidence. Genuine investigative journalism covering a real celebrity statement typically originates from one team, with one editorial process, one fact-checking pass, and then gets covered, cited, and reworded by other outlets. After the fact, each new version explicitly referencing where the story came from. What this cluster shows instead is closer to simultaneous, parallel production. Multiple differently named channels, publishing structurally near identical scripts within days or weeks of each other, none clearly citing any of the others as a source, all converging on the same unverifiable central claim at roughly the same time. That production pattern is consistent with automated or semi-automated content generation, likely using large language model scripting tools paired with AI voice synthesis, distributed across multiple channels, specifically to maximize how many times the same fabricated hook can appear in front of the same audience without looking like an obvious single source repeating itself. None of this required subpoenaing anyone or breaking any story wide open through insider access. It required exactly the same discipline the earlier investigations in this format have used every time. Read past the headline, check whether a primary source actually exists, and pay attention when a platform's own disclosure tools are already telling you something important that the video itself is not. The tools for this kind of check are not locked behind any paywall or professional credential. They are the same search bar, the same platform disclosure labels, and the same 5 minutes of patience available to anyone reading this right now. The reveal here does not happen in a laboratory or a records office. It happens the moment you realize the investigation was never really about proving a negative at all. It was about noticing that the platform hosting this content had already done part of the work for you, and almost nobody thought to read that label. Picture the actual moment this becomes clear, because it is worth picturing accurately rather than dramatically. Not a whistleblower stepping forward, not a dramatic unmasking, just a small line of text sitting quietly beneath the video's title and description, easy to scroll past on a phone screen at midnight, stating plainly that the content above it involved altered or fully generated sound or visuals. That label was not hidden. It was not classified. It was sitting in exactly the same public space as the video itself, available to every single one of the millions of people who watched, shared, and commented on this story, and the overwhelming majority of them never read it because nothing about the viewing experience prompts anyone to. Here's the plain language version of what that means, translated out of platform policy language into actual stakes. A voice that sounds like Mel Gibson, delivering a quote that sounds like something a serious, historically minded public figure might plausibly say about a real, genuinely fascinating ancient text, was very likely never spoken by Mel Gibson at all. Not paraphrased from something he said in a different context. Not exaggerated from a real but more modest comment. Manufactured, using tools sophisticated enough that a platform specifically built to detect this kind of content still required an explicit disclosure label to flag it for viewers who would otherwise have no way of knowing. The real Ethiopian Bible, with its genuinely preserved Book of Enoch and its genuinely Dead Sea Scroll-corroborated Book of Jubilees, did not need any of this. It is fascinating entirely on its own. Someone decided it needed a fabricated celebrity spokesperson anyway. Sit with that for a second, because it is not simply a story about one misleading video. It is a story about how easily a real person's actual, well-earned public reputation, built over decades of genuine, verifiable work, can be borrowed without consent and grafted onto a claim that person never made, specifically because their real history makes the fabricated claim sound plausible. Gibson spent years and a substantial amount of his own money making a historically researched film about biblical events. That real investment, real reputation, real credibility, built the exact foundation someone else used to make an invented quote about an unrelated ancient text sound believable enough to spread to millions of people who had no easy way to check it themselves. Consider, too, how quiet the actual mechanism behind all of this really is compared to how dramatic its effect has been. Nobody hacked a network broadcast, nobody forged a physical document. A convincing enough synthetic voice, a plausible enough script, and a distribution strategy spread across enough differently named channels turned out to be sufficient, all on their own, to generate millions of views around a claim with no verifiable origin at all. That is not a story about a single clever con artist outsmarting a handful of people. It is a story about how low the actual technical and effort threshold has fallen for generating something that used to require real access, a real camera, and a real consenting interview subject. Think about what that borrowed credibility actually costs, and who pays for it. It is not simply Mel Gibson's problem, though it is certainly that. It is every viewer who shared this video believing they were passing along a genuine verified insight from someone with real expertise, only to have unknowingly spread a synthetic voice performing a script nobody with that expertise ever wrote or approved. The damage runs in both directions at once. A real person's likeness gets used without consent, and an audience genuinely interested in real biblical history gets handed a fabrication instead of the substantially more interesting true story sitting right next to it the entire time. What it means for how you should read the rest of this particular content ecosystem going forward is worth spelling out plainly. It means the Ethiopian Orthodox Church's genuinely remarkable 81-book canon, its preservation of Enoch and Jubilees, its real corroboration through the Dead Sea Scrolls, remains exactly as fascinating and exactly as true as it was before any of this fabrication started circulating, and none of that real substance requires a celebrity spokesperson to justify people's interest in it. It means at least one confirmed instance of AI-generated synthetic audio exists inside this specific content cluster, discovered through nothing more than reading a disclosure label the platform itself already provided, which strongly suggests the broader cluster shares a similar production method, even where individual videos have not yet been labeled. And it means the absence of any legitimate news coverage connecting Gibson to this specific claim, despite entertainment journalism's well-documented ongoing interest in covering nearly everything he says publicly, is itself a meaningful, checkable piece of evidence, rather than a gap that should simply be shrugged off. That raises real questions that do not have clean answers yet, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Who is actually operating behind this specific cluster of channels, whether it represents one coordinated production effort, or several separate, unconnected creators independently arriving at the same AI-assisted template because it happens to perform well, is not something this investigation can definitively answer from the outside. How much total revenue this specific fabricated quote trend has generated before any correction, labeling, or takedown occurred is not publicly available information as of this telling. And whether Mel Gibson or his representatives have issued or ever will issue any formal response to this specific cluster of videos is genuinely unknown. No such statement surfaced in this research, and its absence should be read as exactly that. An absence, not as either confirmation or denial of anything. There is a further question worth naming, even though it cannot be answered here. What legal or platform policy recourse actually exists for a real public figure whose voice and likeness get used this way without consent, spread across dozens of accounts rather than one identifiable source? Voice likeness rights and AI-specific legislation are genuinely still developing areas of law in most jurisdictions, and a case spread this thin across this many separate uploads represents exactly the kind of enforcement challenge that existing takedown and impersonation frameworks were not originally built to handle efficiently. That is not a criticism of any specific platform or lawmaker. It is simply an honest acknowledgement that the tools available to address this kind of harm are still catching up to how easy this kind of harm has become to produce. To be fully honest about where this leaves things, it is entirely possible some individual creator somewhere genuinely misunderstood or misremembered a real, more modest comment Gibson made about biblical apocrypha in general, and that a distorted version of that real comment is what eventually mutated into this specific, much more dramatic fabricated claim. That is a real possibility worth naming rather than dismissing outright, and it is different from deliberate, malicious fabrication from scratch, even though the end result, an unverifiable quote spreading at scale with at least one confirmed instance of synthetic audio attached, looks functionally identical either way to anyone encountering it today. There is a bigger pattern worth naming before we close this out, and it reaches well past one celebrity and one ancient book. We are moving into a period where a convincing voice and a plausible premise are no longer reliable signals of anything at all, where the specific, confident details that once made a claim feel more trustworthy, a named person, a dramatic pause, a direct quote, can now be manufactured at almost no cost and distributed at essentially unlimited scale. The real defense against that is not cynicism toward every piece of media you encounter. It is exactly the habit this entire investigation modeled, noticing when a claim depends entirely on one unverifiable source, checking whether that source can actually be traced to something real, and paying attention to the disclosure tools platforms already give you, quietly, right beneath the video, whether or not you ever bother to read them. That habit costs almost nothing, And it is available to literally everyone watching this right now on the exact same phone you would otherwise use to keep scrolling past the next confident, well-produced claim. It does not require technical expertise, a journalism degree, or special access. It requires exactly the same handful of minutes this investigation used. Search for the primary source, notice if the same claim keeps appearing in structurally identical form across unrelated accounts, and read the small print the platform already put there for you. Run it back one more time. A real ancient 81-book biblical canon, preserved for centuries by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, containing texts like Enoch and Jubilees that vanished almost entirely from the rest of Christianity and were later corroborated by an entirely independent discovery in the Dead Sea Scrolls. A real, decades-long, well-documented public interest in serious biblical history from a specific, famous public figure, built through years of genuine, verifiable work. And then, sometime in the last several months, dozens of near-identical videos borrowing that real reputation to deliver a, quote, no legitimate news source has ever traced back to him. At least one confirmed by the hosting platform itself to contain synthetic audio or visuals. So here's what I want to know from you. Now that you know what to check, the primary source, the platform's own disclosure label, the pattern of templated titles, how many other celebrity reveals in your feed right now would survive the same 5 minutes of checking this one did not? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this pulled you in, wait until you see what happened when researchers ran the exact same check on a completely different viral expert confession video making the rounds right now. That one's next. Go watch it.